Let's begin Lesson 38, entitled The Fighting Begins. In this one, we're going to look at the first 2 years of the Civil War, from 1861 to 1863. We can compare how the war affected slaves and free blacks. We can explain the importance of leaders such as Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, and we're going to meet a man named William Carney. That we can explain major events of the war, such as the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg and the Emancipation Proclamation. We can analyze the leadership qualities of Lincoln and also the contributions of General Stonewall Jackson of the Confederacy. So let's get going. In our last lesson, we said that the war began with the Battle of Fort Sumter in April of 1861. But the Battle of Fort Sumter was an artillery battle that was fought over water. There were no actually armies involved in that. So here in the first real land battle of the war is the First Battle of Bull Run, which takes place a couple of months later in July of 1861. Now, both sides expected this war to be very short and glorious, to be a quick victory for themselves. And in fact, as the armies amassed and began this battle, people came from Washington and sat up on the hills overlooking the battle. Many of them brought picnics. They expected this to be entertaining. They thought this was very exciting and that it would be over very quickly. But what looked like a sure Union victory with overwhelming numbers turned shockingly to be a Confederate victory, and the spectators were forced to run and flee as the battle came into their area. This was a real shock to the North because they expected this to be a very quick, glorious war. This battle also showed the inexperience of Union commanders because it was ultimately the lack of leadership and experience in Union commanders that led to the loss at Bull Run for the Union. However, the Confederacy found for themselves a hero in one of their leaders, a colonel at the time, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who earns his nickname at this battle when he leads a counterattack against the Union. And the saying goes, look, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall. So he becomes an important leader and a hero to the Confederate side. Now, the Civil War involved literally hundreds of battles, but in our study here, we're going to look at just a handful that were very important and had real turning point or very important repercussions to the outcome of the war. And one of those is the Battle of Antietam, which took place over a year after the First Battle of Bull Run on September 17, 1862. In this battle, General Lee and the Confederates actually invaded the North, coming through the state of Maryland. They were met by a Union force under the command of General George McClellan near Sharpsburg, Maryland, at Antietam Creek. And this gets us into a little bit of Civil War history. The Union tended to name battles after a nearby body of water. So for the Union, this is the Battle of Antietam. The South, however, tended to name the battles after the nearest community. So in the South, the same battle is called the Battle of Sharpsburg. What makes the Battle of Antietam important for a number of reasons. One, historically, it is the bloodiest single day in U.S. history with over 25,000 casualties. So think of all the wars the U.S. has been involved in. This is the single bloodiest day, the most casualties of any battle of any war on one day. Just to define a casualty, that means somebody lost either through death, injury, or they turn up missing. Now, the Battle of Antietam was fought over a day and was ultimately a draw. Neither side really had a clear advantage, but they did stop Lee's invasion of the North, so the Union considered it a victory and advertised it as such. However, the next day, instead of pursuing Lee's army and attempting to destroy that army, McClellan allowed his own troops to rest and allowed Lee's army to escape. Lincoln was so angered by this that he fired McClellan as the Union commander. So McClellan was one of a number of Union commanders who, while they had some successes, would ultimately fail in their leadership, while Lincoln looked for the leader who was going to lead them to victory. The Battle of Antietam was important for another reason, though, and that is the Emancipation Proclamation. Leading up to the war, Northern abolitionists had been urging Lincoln and pressuring him to issue an edict freeing the slaves. Lincoln, however, was undecided by this. He didn't want to anger the border states, which were those few states in the south of the Union who still practiced slavery. However, the victory at Antietam gives Lincoln the confidence to move forward with this, and on January 1st, 1863, he declares the Emancipation Proclamation, which says that all slaves will be freed in captured Confederate territory. Notice Confederate territory, so this does not affect the border states, which are part of the Union. This is a morale boost to the North. It gives them a cause for the war. The other idea here is that Lincoln's using his war powers to deny the Confederacy the benefit of their slave labor. So when they move into a southern area and they free the slaves, this takes away that labor force that the Confederacy needs to maintain their war effort. And here we see another important consequence of the Emancipation Proclamation for both the North and the South, and that is that after the Emancipation Proclamation, freed African American slaves and freemen are able to join the Union war effort by enlisting in the Army for the first time. One of the first of these units is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. They are commanded by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Now, their officers were white. Colonel Shaw was from Boston. He was Harvard educated. He came from a strong abolitionist family. So he organized and led the 54th Massachusetts. In July of that year, the 54th led the Union attack on Fort Wagner, South Carolina, just on the coast, just outside of Charleston. This attack failed, and over half of the 54th was lost in the battle, and Colonel Shaw and many of his officers were killed. And this story of this battle and this regiment is told in a very good movie called Glory. It stars Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, and Matthew Broderick. If you ever get a chance to watch it, this is an excellent story and an excellent movie about the Civil War and the contributions of African Americans to the war effort. Now, while the 54th was defeated at Fort Wagner and lost a number of their soldiers, this was a very important battle and a very important outcome because many people believed that African Americans would not make good soldiers because they would be unwilling or unable to fight effectively. But in showing that not only were they willing to fight, but they would fight with great bravery, honor, and distinction, the 54th battle at Fort Wagner changed many people's minds about African Americans. It also resulted in a burst of African American enlistment. Over 180,000 black soldiers would fight for the Union, which was a significant boost in their manpower and a real advantage to the North. And one of the soldiers at Fort Wagner, William Carney, was awarded the Medal of Honor 1900, many years later, but in doing so, he became the first African American to earn the U.S.'s highest military award, the Congressional Medal of Honor. The years in the late 1862 and early 1863 were not very good for the Union war effort, in fact, and they lost a number of battles, including two important ones. One, December 1862 at Fredericksburg, where they were under the command of Ambrose Burnside, one of the worst generals in U.S. history, and later in May at the Battle of Chancellorsville under the command of Joe Hooker, where a much larger Union force was defeated by a smaller but better led and better organized Confederate force. However, the Confederacy had a big loss at Chancellorsville when General Stonewall Jackson was killed by friendly fire. What happened was he was riding out, looking at the battlefield near sunset, and one of his soldiers mistook his gray uniform for blue and shot him, believing he was a Union general. So the South loses one of their very best leaders in Stonewall Jackson's death. However, a couple of months later, in June 1863, Lee would again invade the North, this time coming through Pennsylvania. This is going to lead to the largest and probably most decisive battle of the war, and that is the Battle of Gettysburg, which takes place outside the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in July of 1863, a battle that lasts for 3 whole days. To get an idea of the scope of this battle, just take a look at the numbers. The Union brought with them almost 94,000 soldiers, where the Confederacy brought almost 72,000. Almost 50,000 men were lost, were casualties of this. Here we see the killed, wounded, and captured. The other thing is that the Battle of Gettysburg is the largest single battle ever fought in the entire continent of North America, on North American soil. As we said, this was a 3-day battle. The first day of the battle tended to go better for the Confederacy. The second day of the battle, however, the Union was able to gather their forces and solidify their position, and they were able to repel and defend themselves against several Confederate attacks. So on the third day of the battle, the Union has organized themselves over here on what is called Cemetery Ridge. The Confederacy is along here on Seminary Ridge, and between them is a large open field almost a mile wide. And in this field, General Lee makes a very fateful decision, and that is to send several divisions of his troops to attack what he thinks is the weakest part of the Union defenses, and that is the center. He sends this army to go straight at them, while he sends this army to appear to be attacking over here. led by General Pickett, but then to suddenly turn in this direction in open field and attack here with General Trimble. So the idea is to focus all his forces on one point and drive a hole in the Union lines. However, Pickett's charge failed because they were crossing open territory and they were cut to pieces by Union artillery and gunfire in their long march over. And the result of this is that the Confederacy loses the Battle of Gettysburg and Lee is forced to retreat. This is also a turning point battle of the war because from this point forward, the Confederacy is driven back to the South and they are never able to invade the Union again. The rest of the war, the Union will be constantly attacking the Confederacy, and General Lee will be on the defensive, fighting from the continuing attacks of the Union forces into the South. To get an idea of what I'm talking about, here you see this open field. This is the area where the Confederate forces were forced to march. You see that they had no cover and no way to hide, and they were too far away to shoot back. So it was on this field that Pickett's division was destroyed and the Battle of Gettysburg was lost for the Confederacy. So our Lesson 38 thoughts. What was the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation on the war efforts of both the Union and the Confederacy? How did freeing blacks both help the Union and how did it affect the Confederacy as well? How did the superior military leaders like Stonewall Jackson benefit the Confederacy in the first years of the war? And finally, why do you think Gettysburg is considered an important turning battle of the war? So our next lesson will be triumph and loss. We'll see you then.